Cool. They should start to come in shortly, and then we'll also distribute this afterwards. Hello, everyone. Who's joining? The old office, Aaron, has that completely closed down now that you've moved?
What's that, sorry?
The old office, has that completely closed?
Yeah, man, I left in March 2020 because of COVID and never went back.
Okay.
Like, gone. And like, now we've got this new place. I've never been in it. It's super weird.
I've started coming out into the WeWork more recently, so I'm over at the one in well, Liverpool Street, so not too far, I guess, from where you guys are going to be now.
Yeah.
And it's getting progressively week by week busier and busier. This week's been really busy.
Definitely. I think it's nice to be out. It's just the commute I find depressing, but even just do it once.
Hey guys, I hope everyone's having a great, I think you're in your 6th week, 5th week of the program. I hope it's going well. We'll give everyone a moment and then we'll get started. Oh, and we've got a question from Tej. The presentations will be in Notion, and if they're not already there, I'll ask Julia and Mamuna to get them uploaded for you. Right, I think we'll probably have more people joining us throughout, but we'll go ahead and get started. Hey everyone, as I said, hope everyone's having a great week. I'll ask Aaron to introduce himself in a moment, and we're going to be talking about term sheets today. What we will say is Aaron's going to be sharing his screen and walking us through term sheets. And then if you've got any questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A box. And what we'll do is in the last 15 to 20 minutes, we'll run through your questions. Yeah, share anything that you have. Brilliant. Aaron, over to you. And then I'm in the background here to help out if anyone needs anything.
Cool. Thanks, Ed. Hi, everyone. I'm a partner at Cooley, and I co-run our emerging companies and venture capital group here in London. As part of my practice, I spend a lot of time helping VCs on their investment into companies, and that also includes spend a lot of time helping companies with VCs investing into companies. That includes in-deal advice on actual investments, but I also spend a lot of time with them outside of actual deals on their form term sheets and how they approach these. And it's kind of this holistic approach to term sheets that I'm going to spend more time on in this session by taking you through an actual term sheet. So if we think about kind of when would a term sheet even be discussed, we're at the stage where the VC sourced the deal, you've built relationships up with founders. Now what? So now is the point where you want to actually execute on the deal. And the first thing you need, more often than not, is a term sheet. So what's the point of a term sheet? Why don't people just go straight to the main document? Well, the point of a term sheet is it sets out, unsurprisingly, the key terms of the actual deal, and it helps parties know whether there's actually a deal in the first place before time and expense, legal fees are incurred by going into the main document. Term sheets are, apart from a couple of aspects, almost always not legally binding, but they are morally binding. And so to say, hey, it's not legally binding, we'll just change the terms as we go, that's not a great way to start what is essentially with venture, a very collaborative relationship. VCs or investors into companies and founders are all partners wanting the same thing, which is success for the company. So to go back on agreed terms isn't a great way to start that. Some VCs may not think too much about a term sheet. There's some key aspects of it that they're very concerned about: valuation, percentage they're getting, maybe board seat. And the rest, sometimes you'll say, well, leave it to the lawyers on what's market standard approach. Now, the issue sometimes with that is there's not always a market standard approach. That can change. But more importantly, really understanding the key aspects of a term sheet as a VC is a really good way to set yourself apart from others who maybe they don't understand it, which can help when the deal is competitive and the founders are concerned about things, the company's concerned about other bits, and to understand why they may be concerned, why their concern over a preference may change how we view it and how we can try and get them comfortable. But if you understand these elements of it, you're far better placed to make progress with the company and actually get that deal. Now, that as a kind of sort of intro to kind of why we have them, I think the best thing is if we just go into a term sheet, add a bit of context, and hopefully this session and some of the things we talk about will bring a few things that you've gained from other sessions together in one place. I'll just share my screen. Now, Seb, just so I can double check, can you see that?
Yeah, I can. It's come up.
Perfect. Okay, great. So first of all, this is, some of you may have seen term sheets before. This is what a term sheet will generally look like. There are some variations on that, but that is, as you run through kind of here on the left-hand side, some key points. So these are the key terms that people want to clarify, and the rest is kind of what that will look like. So that's kind of what it looks like as a whole. So here at the top, you'll see that, remember what I said as far as kind of, it's not meant to be legally binding, okay? And so the term sheet at some point will make very clear that there are certain elements that are meant to be legally binding, but this isn't a deal. Like, we still need to do certain things from a VC perspective. So sometimes you see that at the beginning, sometimes you see that at the end, but every term sheet should be clear on the fact that it isn't legally binding other than certain aspects of that. And almost always you'll see the term sheet starting out going straight into the economics of the deal. That's a thing that people look for straight away. From a company perspective, when maybe there are multiple term sheets that the company is expecting, it wants to know kind of what the investor is valuing the company at. And often, particularly when you're at a Series A and onwards, this isn't something that the company has kind of suggested. This is what the investor, the VC, has decided it thinks is the valuation. That is something that's negotiable, but you'll see different term sheets with different valuations, and that feeds into how companies kind of look to choose their VC or their investor partner. So in this particular deal, we have ABC Limited. You can see, obviously, lots of imagination has gone into the names here. And we have DEF Ventures. And we know, if we look at the pure economics of this, we have a 3 million financing round, and we know that DEF Ventures is taking 2 million. So already we know that DEF Ventures is taking a majority of this particular round, okay? We also know that they want 12.12% of the fully diluted share capital, and that they valued this company from a pre-money valuation at 13.5 million. So the key thing to take from this is what is this 12.12% and what we're talking about with the fully diluted share capital of the company. Now, the company share capital is made up of issued shares, granted options, maybe there are some loan notes, maybe there's a couple of safes, some ASAs. All of these things together that exist at the time of the investment make up the fully diluted share capital of the company. And so what the investor is essentially saying is, look, everything you've got as far as your share capital is concerned, I want included into this 13.5 million, so that when we close, we get 12.12%, and there's no surprises afterwards. It's not that we get 12.12% and then there are some low notes converting and and some more, maybe some warrants or something. And actually, it's not 12.12% of the fully diluted. It's 9.3% of the fully diluted. And so the investor's always going to be very clear that this is the percentage they want of the fully diluted share capital of the company. And that's all understood. Where there can be some discussion between the investor and founders or the company is what we're going to do about the option pool. Now, granted, options are one thing, and they go into the pre-money. But what about options we haven't issued yet? Now, an investor will say, look, we know that the company needs to incentivize employees and future hires. And so we think there needs to be an option pool. And because we're taking the risk and we're backing, we think that should be something that's on the existing shareholders rather than on everyone to share. And so you'll often see this number, in this case, we've got 10%, is included in the pre-money. And what that essentially means is this increase of an option pool is already built into this 12.12%. Now, by the way, this isn't a maths class, and there's a lot more you can talk about, so I won't spend too long on the numbers, but the point is that they want to make sure that with the option pool for options to be allocated and everything that already exists at the time of the investment is already built in. Now, what that really means is the fact that the pre-money valuation of the company isn't 13.5 million. The effective pre-money is less than that because we're already building in 10% of options that are yet to be issued. And so founders go, or companies go, well, hang on a minute, I thought it was a 13.5 million pre-money valuation. It's not, it's less than that. Now, having your option pool, an allocated option pool built into the pre-money is super normal. You do see variations, and it will depend on whether it's a highly competitive situation, company has leverage. Maybe you'll see the option pool be in the post. So instead of kind of built into the pre, it's done later. So what that means is instead of everyone apart from the new investors getting diluted by that, if it's in the post, everyone shares that pro rata. Sometimes you'll see that maybe there's a top up. You have companies already got an option pool, maybe it's 4%. There's been a discussion, they think, actually, we think between like now and the next financing round, we need 8%. So there's a 4% top up that's needed. And sometimes you'll see the top up go into the post, but it really will come down to the discussion between investor and company. But ultimately, it's a valuation question. Like you could stick the additional amount on the pre-money and it has the same effect. So I think that's the kind of the main takeaway from kind of what we're talking about as far as economics. What is, when they talk about their percentage and they talk about the fully diluted share capital, what does that mean? And then as far as even when we can get comfortable with where this option pool is going, what's the number? And some of you may have seen before, but 10% is quite a normal number. But what does that really mean? It may be absolutely spot on for some companies. It might not be for others. And so from a VC perspective, when putting term sheets out there, it's important to think about what a company actually needs. Now, companies should spend some time pre even speaking to investors, planning out as far as their business plan and their budget, what they think their hiring needs are going to be until the next financing round. So when they're having a conversation with the investors, they can say, look, we actually think we've actually already done some aggressive growth pre-Series A. We don't need as much. Some of the key hires we've already got. We've got a pool of 5%. We don't think we'll need any more than 7%. So 7% is more realistic than 10%. We just don't need 10%. And if you're able to demonstrate why that's the case, then most investors are going to say, okay, that makes sense. But that's a conversation. But from an investor perspective, to understand what it actually means and the effect on dilution and what the effective pre-money is for founders, existing shareholders on the company, that will help you when you're talking about a term sheet, when and a founders are saying, we don't want 10%, we want less. Like, what does it really mean? And that's what it really means. It really comes down to a dilution question and a valuation question. So then scrolling down, you'll see very often dividends in a term sheet. And it's a slight red herring because early stage emerging companies prior to an IPO will almost never pay dividends. but it just is something that you see in there. And all it's basically saying is, look, if you pay dividends, then it's pari passu, like, so equally given to everyone else, prorated. And what investors are really trying to make clear, even though they know that the dividends aren't really going to be issued, is that when we come to talk about what we are in a second, liquidation preference, that this isn't a backdoor way to avoid investors getting their liquidation preference by giving dividends to the existing ordinary shareholders and not giving it to this Series A. So they just want to sort of some protection in the docs that's clear, because it does have a genuine effect on what they get, but it isn't really a thing because dividends really they're never paid. And then we come down to kind of what are probably the two most important things when we talk about preferences. So we have a Series A, say this term sheet's based on a Series A financing, and it would be very, very normal to be Series A preference shares. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes they're around where you'll have the Series A at odds, but more often than not, we're talking preference shares. And the two, when we say preference shares, we're really talking about a liquidation preference and anti-dilution. And these two things are often seen to be very scary from founders. They've been on blogs and they're like, no, these things are so bad for us, we don't want them. But ultimately, what these things are downside protection. They are not supposed to give investors any upside. What the liquidation preference is really designed to do is say, look, if things don't go as well as we thought, and there's some type of liquidity event, and liquidation preference, which is such a normal term, but it's so misleading because we're not really talking about liquidation. What we're really talking about is a sale. So if we had say there's a sale, and the investors are saying, look, we're last money in, we're taking the risk, we've accepted what your valuation is, which, by the way, at this stage of a company, isn't really based on a huge amount. This is not the same way that companies are based as far as M&A deals or PE. Like, there isn't the same amount of information. So there's a lot of buy-in that investors need to actually agree this type of valuation. But they say, look, okay, fine, this is what we're doing. But if for any reason there's some type of sale that means that we're not getting all our money back, we want to make sure that we're getting paid that back first, or as much of that back first, before anyone else. They've paid a certain amount for their shares. The founders will be incorporated with their shareholding, and they want to ensure the fact that if it doesn't go as well as they thought, that they're getting that back. And there are different types of liquidation preference here. The wording here is really normal. And what the key thing is this here. And what that means when it says 1 times their investment amount, with the remaining proceeds distributed among the ordinary shares in the company pro rata to the number of share sales. And what that means is it's a 1 times non-participating preference. And this is the multiple. And the fact that after they get their money back, it then divided between the ordinaries is the non-participating. Now, if the term sheet was to say that, and that then becomes a multiple participating preference. And that's really aggressive approach to take. And you can look at it from an investor perspective and say, well, hang on a minute. It means that if there is a sale, that we're going to get twice our money back, and then we're going to share in the proceeds. That sounds great. Now, aside from the fact that it's not a market position to take and it's very aggressive, but there may be corner cases in certain situations where that does, but in a normal situation, it won't. So to give over a term sheet that has something so aggressive, the company and the founders are going to have, they're going to react emotively to that. They're going to make an assumption of the investor based on this type of provision, when really, like I said, these things should be downside protection only. And what that, to go back, what it really says is we get our money back before it goes to anyone else. But the reality is, in most companies where they're doing, say, a Series A or a seed round, the valuation of a company, like if the company isn't sold such that the investor added for a valuation that they're coming in such that they're getting their money back, there's probably bigger problems. Okay, so it often isn't really such an important thing for investors earlier on, but at the same time, we're all in this to know that it's going to be some big outcome, and there's not going to be a liquidation preference because everyone shares pro rata. But it isn't such a scary thing for companies and for founders because of that. And similarly with anti-dilution, this doesn't mean investors don't get diluted. What this means is that, hey, we are buying into this valuation, like I said before, but if there's another round and it happens to be at a price less than what we're paying, we've obviously got a bad deal and the valuation wasn't what we thought. So we want to be made up some to that. And there are different formulas for anti-dilution, different mechanics. And here is broad-based weighted average. And they're genuine formulas. So I won't go into kind of like how they work, but this one is the fairest one that you see all the time. It takes into consideration other parts of the capital like options. And then you have the most aggressive, which is full ratchet, which basically says we want the same price. You want to issue your bonus shares to make us up to the same price. And like I said, that's aggressive. And so if we sort of go back to what I was saying, as far as if you take it from a VC, we really want into this company, what do we want them to think when we're giving the term sheet? These are the couple of things, knowing already that some companies and founders are already a little bit uneasy about these type of preferences, but then to do something that's not market and have multiple participating preferences and a full ratchet, they're gonna make a judgment about you, like you as an investor, and assuming that there are other shows in town, that's not where they're going to go. But it's also a reputational thing, because this isn't what we see in the market, and it will people will understand in the market quite quickly that that's kind of what this particular VC fund is asking for. And then we come to the board, and so here is another area of a term sheet that founders in particular have strong emotive reactions about. Every time you're doing an investment, always think, particularly sort of earlier on with companies, founders take time sometimes to understand that the company isn't just theirs. If things aren't going well, they don't agree with something someone said, there's no kind of picking the ball up and going home, no one else is playing. The company exists, other people are invested in it, you have investors, you have employees. So the company itself is the most important thing. And the founders are obviously key to that, but it's not just their thing to make all the decisions and determinations about. There's obviously going to be a certain amount of founder control for a long period of time, and that's all fine. But if you understand the fact that the founders, when they go in, are kind of often have this view of it, in this particular situation, we have the founders, for as long as they have 10% and they remain employed, they have one director on the board. And we know there are two founders. So two founders, but one board seat for them. And we have DEF Ventures, who has a right to appoint two. So a founder controlled board at an investor controlled board at Series A, and you're going straight into suggest that super punchy, and they're likely to have a reaction to it. And so the main thing to think about is, like, what are the things that we really care about, that we want to make sure that, look, if we don't control the board, what rights do we have to stop them making really silly decisions that take away the value for the shares we have and the investment that we've made? And often you'll find that is more here at investor consent level. And sometimes you may see that as there's investor consent, so that's a more a shareholder level key things. And then you might have another section that is investor director consent, that's a more procedural. But ultimately it's kind of, look, board makes decisions, we don't need to control it, but these things that are listed, you need to ask permission for. So knowing kind of how that there's going to be the reaction, knowing kind of like where there are other protections already built in, will change the way you think about what it is that you're looking to do. Now, not every company is different, because there is a difference between founders that have been doing this for the last 3 years, 4 years, maybe it's not their first company, to maybe two people out of university, first venture, been on some form of accelerator, really only know each other for like the last sort of couple of months. Here, there may be some more control that's needed because they need that guidance. But ultimately, with these constructs, the investor consent constructs is usually where you're going to need to get you where you need to be. So thinking about these investor consents. And so if we think that decision-making for day-to-day happens at board level, what are the things that they need to then go to the investors for? And now really these should be the key decisions, bearing in mind that it does depend on kind of sophistication and experience of company and founders. But often you'll see these things listed out. And so in this particular term sheet, we have these things listed out. And you often see them, this is actually a fairly medium-sized list. Sometimes you see these things are a lot longer, but it's important to think about this from a VC perspective, an investor perspective. What are the things that you really care about that they need to ask your permission for? And so here we have altering share capital, creating new classes of share. I mean, that's effectively saying, hey, if there's you want to do a new financing round, you got to ask us. That's fine, but it depends on who we're talking through. From a VC perspective, it might be DES Ventures are leading this round. We control the Series A, but maybe there's been one, maybe two rounds of seed rounds beforehand that maybe hold more of the shares. And so the investor majority might not be controlled by DF or by you when you're coming in. So understanding what that looks like and where you can maybe build in class level protection. So that maybe we don't want to control the investor majority. In this case, it's in the term sheet, we will. But often term sheets are given out before there's been a discussion with the existing. So we don't know whether they're going to agree with that or not. But it's also worth thinking about who are the other investors. You know, if they're funds that we know, they're sophisticated funds that do this a lot, maybe we don't mind so much, particularly if we have class level control, like don't do anything with our Series A shares. So the investor majority can say yes or no to these things, but they can't say, hey, no more preferences on the A's and no more board seats for the A's. They can't change that. But the other sort of type of investor from a VC perspective to just be aware of is the strategic. And so the strategic is not like a financial VC investor. They are maybe in the same market, same industry, that do some investing. And so then you have considerations over, one is like information, but also if a strategic will have a different way of thinking about what a good outcome is, an exit. Like a VC will be aligned with the founders. The bigger the value, the bigger the exit, the bigger success. Strategics often want to buy the company. So they go in because they want to actually then acquire it at some point. And so the more expensive it is, isn't the best outcome. So where they have blocks, sometimes could mean that they're going to say, no, you can take cash from us, but you can't take it from somewhere else, or we're going to make sure that the value goes down for a company so that we can then acquire you for as little as possible. And that's worst case scenario, but it's something I've seen happen because too much control has been given to these types of investors who really are just in this to try and acquire the company. And so strategics, pure strategics, not like a Google Ventures, which is a more kind of VC, it's not really a strategic, but non-venture strategics, like companies that go into it, the VC funds can be quite wary of it because there isn't the alignment in where they see the outcome and where they see the decisions being made. So as part of if you're diligencing, if you're thinking about doing the investment, everything could seem great, but understanding what the existing investor base looks like, understanding who else is coming in, understanding what that looks like will really help save a lot of hassle, because these are things that also feed in. Like it can be a great proposition, but if you don't have control with someone who's not aligned with the way you're thinking, that could be a problem. And there are certain things in this list that you just don't need the investor majority. It's just going to slow the company down. And things like granting share options from the option plan, that may seem like pretty normal. Now, the normal aspect of this, and we talk about what we were talking about at the start, was the company needs a share option pool. We've already agreed 10% in the pre, so we're already protected from an investor perspective that there's no more increase of the pool. It's 10%, but other than that, the company can decide who it awards the options to as it grows. And so granting share options is probably a bit too far. That said, often you'll see a restriction on the granting of options to founders, because we want there to be incentivization for the full workforce for the next, say, 18 months, not to kind of say from a founder perspective, great, this increases our equity. So sometimes you see that restriction, but for an investor majority, to have to go and ask the investor majority every time you want to grant an option really is going to hamper the ability for companies to be able to make decisions quickly, scale at pace. So that's what we're ultimately looking to do. And there needs to be protection for investors with their investment, of course, but also the ability for companies to be able to be efficient in its decision making. So it's finding a balance between the two. And I spend a lot of time with VCs going through this type of list that they have, and we have market standard documents, which is twice the size of this, and going through each one and thinking about, is this something that you're genuinely concerned about? Where do you see the risk here? Because there are things that you could take out that make it seem that actually you do understand that the board is trustworthy enough to make certain decisions, other than these where we need to kind of have some control. And as the company gets more sophisticated, the more rounds it does, the board becomes more balanced, and there are more investor directors, and their founder directors, maybe an independent. And then we're not worrying so much because the company is pretty sophisticated at that stage. There's more of a concern earlier on. But like I said, you can build in these protections for things like this. And then we have, which is often the most emotive thing for founders, is talking about founder vesting and leaver. Now, when I am advising a company, the first thing that I do when I speak to the founders is talk to them about vesting and leaver and the importance of it, particularly with multiple founders. It's a much easier conversation because founders will go, well, this is my company, and I don't like the idea that in any situation, whatever it is, I can lose any of my shares. That doesn't seem fair because I started this. And then you say, okay, we'll take your co-founder, defrauds the company out of 3 million, goes on a shooting spree. They own 50% of the company. Is it right they get to walk away and keep 50% of the company? I'm like, well, no, of course not. That's not right. And so it's helping founders understand that this founder vesting is super important to protect them from other founders, not just a mechanism for investors to try and take away their shares. And that's often kind of how they think about this to start with. And so how this is worded and how the vesting schedule looks and when they could lose shares, and so we talk about good leaver, bad leaver, and cause, how that looks and how that's worded is going to be really important in a term sheet, because founders will make a judgment of a fund based on how they see this, because it is really important from a company perspective, a founder's perspective, investor perspective, that this works as it's supposed to work. I've seen many examples where companies don't deal with this, particularly early on. They're just getting started. This is super exciting. We don't worry about this kind of like vesting. Hey, we're all friends. And then for one reason or another, someone leaves and they've walked away with a big chunk of the shareholding, and company can't make decisions anymore because in England, we need to get to 75% to pass the really big shareholder decisions and like changing the articles, which means we need to do for a financing round. So now we can't do a financing round. And there's no way of getting that back. You need them to agree, and companies it's a real mess. And so understanding from a VC perspective what this really means and how founders can see it and how there needs to be a balance, and how getting them to see how it's protection for themselves as well will be really useful in getting this sorted and getting founders comfortable. Because at the same time as this is about protection, this is also about motivation and incentivization for a founder. If a founder feels as if they can have their shares taken away from them at any given time, they're not going to be that motivated to provide their blood, sweat, and tears to grow the value of the company. And so it needs to be balanced in that respect. And so this particular clause has it says 25% of the shares will vest after 1 year, and the rest vests monthly for the further 3 years. And that's quite a standard vesting schedule, which is, you may have heard, it's a 4-year vesting with 1 year cliff. Now, that is a very normal vesting schedule to have for employees with options. And the cliff is 25%. So it effectively means, look, in 1 year, if you stay for a year, you have 25% vested, and the rest we vest monthly over 3 years. But if you leave at any time between now and a year, you get nothing. Now, for a company that's being invested in at Series A that maybe has been going for the last 4 years or so, founders are going, that doesn't seem very fair to me, because I feel like I've earned enough to have vested already. And so for a VC to think about that and about kind of what is fair to say has vested, they have earned a certain amount. And a cliff, this 25% cliff, is really, think of it like a probationary period. It makes sense if you're an employee, you've just started, and we don't know if this is going to work out. We don't want to give you equity for nothing. But for founders that have been growing this to the point that the investor's going to invest in it, the probationary period doesn't really make sense anymore. And so having a certain amount vested already, then vesting over a certain period of time makes sense. And that will really demonstrate to the founder that you're actually supporting them as well. And this is not about trying to take things away from them. And then, so that's the vesting schedule. And then you have the sort of lever. And in this particular term sheet, it says, if you depart for cause, which is to be agreed between the company and DF Ventures. Now, that's a sort of a lazy way of dealing with it. But from a founder perspective, how do I feel about that? Like, I've agreed to do the deal with you. And then it turns out the cause means, like, I used the wrong type of toilet paper. Now I'm being fired, I'm losing all my shares, and I hadn't realized. And so a term sheet that kind of sets out very clearly what cause is, what bad lever is, because if it's something that's really, really, really bad, then you lose all your shares, no matter about vesting. And there are different approaches to this, is when I say about kind of, hey, it's market standard. This is one aspect that there isn't a pure market standard. Every deal is exactly the same. There are variations, but you got to think about what's fair. And, if a founder leaves for anything other than something that's horrifically bad, that really does affect the company and the value of the company and the reputation of the company. You have to keep their shares. But you see different formulations, and you see resignation, and you see, but it shouldn't include things like poor performance. I mean, that's just, it's just poor performance. And there is a founder is the same as anyone else. A founder is an employee. The service agreement is still an employment agreement. They still have the same protections. So there's still a process, but making sure you understand how this works and how it feeds in and how founders will think about it is really important. And like every term sheet that I do and I look at, this is probably the area that we spend most time on, because of how founders see it and how this is mine, and trying to get them to see it more. And you could already, particularly in competitive situations, you can go in straight away with something that seems far fairer than lots of the other term sheets that will go in, and give a much better chance of kind of securing the investment just by small changes to this, which don't change anything for the VC, for the investor. They just want to make sure that there is protection there. And then you have some areas which are more kind of like we've dealt with economic rights, we've dealt with kind of control, kind of decision making, and then we have sort of more just share rights. And then drag is very, very normal, and effectively just means, look, if we just get a really good offer for someone to sell a company, like wants to buy the company, and the right people agree, then everyone's in. So you can't have minorities that maybe hold a few shares here and there saying, we don't like this deal. We're saying no. Well, maybe they're just on holiday and you just can't track them down, but we can't do the deal because they're saying no. And so there are mechanics built in to the documents, into the articles, that say, look, hey, if the investor, in this case, investor majority want to do it, then everyone's in. Now, that would be very aggressive again, because that basically means investor majority who hold 12%, maybe let's say the investor majority is DEF Ventures. DEF hold 12% of the company. So if DEF want to sell, and they want to sell all of their shares to a purchaser, then they're dragging the founders, they're dragging the rest of the shareholders. That would be aggressive, and that wouldn't really be fair. But what you'd often see is, in the event of, say, more than 50% of the shares held, equity shares held, so the ords and the preference shares, plus an investor majority want to sell, everyone's in. Preemption rights. This is something investors in particular can feel really passionate about. Effectively, company wants to raise a new financing round, and before it can then issue shares to a new investor, it has to offer them to its existing shareholders. Traditionally in the UK, we've seen this as all shareholders get this right. And there are different views on kind of what is fair and what isn't, but from a company perspective, having all shareholders have the right reduces the chances of getting that investment in. It's harder to get, it's a bigger slice of the pie, it's potentially all of it, whereas it's not just about the cash when you're talking about doing a new financing round. With new investors coming in, it's not just the cash, it's about new network, it's about understanding the market, it's a new perspective, it's opening doors. So there's a lot of additional value that new investors can have that is what companies want when they're doing this. And they want to be able to have their existing follow on and be part of it, but they don't want to prevent a new investor from coming in who's not going to want to spend time and money doing some diligence on the company when it doesn't even know how much of the round it's going to get or whether it can do it anyway. So here we say that investors get the right, and that means that investors are only going to have they're going to have a smaller portion. Say if it was just, say there was only one investor and it's DEF, that means that the company's only giving away potentially 12% of the financing round, and makes it far more likely that the investment's going to happen. And that's kind of a priority. So even when I'm advising investors who, we're looking at what that means, we have to think about what's best for the company, and the company being able to do the round is what's best, taking into consideration who is making the decision. And there are different protections you can build in, particularly where if it's waivable by an investor majority and it's waiving for all investors, what happens when those waiving investor majority investors participate? But there are protections you can build in for that. But the ability to waive is important, and having it as a smaller piece of the pie, particularly when you get to later rounds and things become very competitive and oversubscribed, that you have more control over that. These, I won't spend any time on these. You may see right of first refusal, tag, co-sale. They're all about kind of what happens in certain share transfer situations. And so here you say in this term sheet, there's not even any time spent on it, because people, this is really an example where customary right of first refusal, tag, and co-sale genuinely means that, because everyone really knows what it means. And in the market standard documents, they are pretty standard and just determine what happens when someone wants to sell shares. Information rights, yeah, so you'll see different bits of that, but it's kind of really think about what it is from an investor perspective that you really need. Annual, here it says quarterly and monthly. Monthly with an early stage company, maybe it's too much. Do you need monthly? Because that means that the company at a stage where it doesn't have a lot of people and a lot of employees, maybe spending more time than it should just preparing reports that investors don't need. And so key information rights for investors, maybe major investors, and that's the same when we talk about preemption rights. Maybe we're reducing that pie of the slice of the pie even further by having it a subset of investors, and the same for information rights. And it's also, from a company perspective, a way of reducing the circulation of confidential information. If it goes to everyone, then you have no real control. So we really want it from a company perspective and an investor perspective, because the investors don't want this information being distributed too widely to too many people, because a lot of it, like I said, is confidential. And then we have warranties. They are a very sort of standard part of kind of investment. And people can get really tied up on warranties, particularly because warranties are the same when you do an M&A deal. So a company's being purchased, and there's a share purchase agreement, and then you have the warranties, and then there's people have a temptation to look at it in the same way. And in a way it is. It does mean, hey, there's a breach of the warranties and there's potential liability. But a venture investment is very different from M&A. An M&A deal, we bought the company, you've told us certain things, you're gone, and it turns out that's not the case. I paid too much. Right, I want to make sure I get that back. With a VC investment, you've never see an investor really making a claim against its own investment. Even where you see things like, and the founders, they have liability too. Now, that makes no sense either, really, and it's not really about the liability. What it's about is making sure the founders do a proper job of disclosure. And that's what warranties are really about. They're not about we want to be able to make a claim and sue for damages after we've invested. They're about, we want to know all the information that we can before we invest. And so when investors and when VCs go into a company, there'll be an element of diligence they'll do, but the diligence is only useful for to a certain amount, because it's really just looking at documents that the company's provided. Now, what if the company hasn't provided all the information? And so then the next step of that is disclosure. And disclosure is basically, you have the set of warranties, own all IP, there's no litigation, the share capital is like you told us it was, the key things that you want to know. And then the company and the founders will go through and say, well, there was that litigation that we had. So then they'll put that in the disclosure letter, so you'll know all the information. And so that's the point of the warranties. But having a 2x annual salary, and it may make sense for some companies, I'd say 1x is more normal. But when companies get a little bit further down the line, having the founders give the warranties, that makes less sense, mainly because they're not the ones doing the disclosure process anymore. And I think we can be confident that the company's going to do a decent job of disclosure. And then we kind of move sort of into the hey, we've talked about the key terms, what else is there? Here we have companies should pay all reasonable fees and expenses incurred by DF Ventures. From an investor perspective, you say that's great because it's uncapped. It's just easier for everyone. Just have an idea about what it's going to cost and put that in there. Conditions to closing. You see these a lot, but they don't. It's a slight red herring as well, because there's no gap between signing and close. So you don't have these genuine conditions to close. You're either going to sign and close or you're not. So just listing these out doesn't really change anything, but you often see it. Then we often have what is the deal with confidentiality and announcement, access. And then there's a temptation when people start getting into this area of the term sheet to go, this is all boilerplate now, let's stop reading, blah, blah, blah. But the exclusivity period is super important. And the exclusivity period is an element of the term sheet that is legally binding. And from a VC perspective is really important, because if we want to dedicate time and effort and fees and everything else to a deal, we don't want to be doing that and then find out that the company's sort of shopping our term sheet around and it's done the deal with somebody else. And so what the exclusivity does is that once they've signed it, that's us done for that period. And so there's nothing that forces a company to have to do the deal, but maybe the company's running out of runway. Maybe they don't want to, the exclusivity period is a genuine way of saying, look, there's you can't do another deal because you can go to court and stop that other deal happening. So this is us for this period of time. Now, 120 days is super long. You generally see, particularly in this market at the moment, maybe 30, but something between 30 and 45 days, enough time to get the deal done so that at least we have comfort from starting this to finish, that there's no we got to a point and then you go to someone else. And then a break fee is super on market. Sometimes you see it in term sheets. There is a temptation for investors to say, hey, look, you've breached the exclusivity, we're not going to force you to do that, but because you've gone against it, then you need to pay us $1 million. And so there's an argument over whether that's even enforceable, but it's if you think about what I was saying, as far as these deals are very collaborative. We are partners together to make the company super successful. This doesn't give that flavor. That's the wrong way to start this out. It's kind of like, look, we're trusting you. We have some exclusivity. We all want to make this work. let's just make this work without putting this sort of thing in it. And this status part is, like I was saying, about what sets out really what's legally binding and what's not legally binding. And then there you have it. So that, I mean, that is very quickly, you could probably spend a session on each of these, to be honest with you. But as far as like an overall, how do these things work? What's important? What do the company, the founders think? How do you approach it? Like from a holistic perspective, they're probably the main aspects. And not every investment is the same. Not every company is the same. There may be variations. There may be reasons why investors want to be a bit more aggressive in places. But your average Series A, it's a great deal. We want to do it. They'll be the things that you want to focus on.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Aaron. That was excellent as always. It's not the longest document in the world, but there's just so much nuance and context, and there's just so many things to think about. So it's always great to kind of get your take on it.
My pleasure.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A. We've got one in here so far, which we'll jump into, but if anyone else wants to ask anything, please go ahead and add something. Ara is asking, are the founders' shares vested at company's expense, or is there a separate clause determining the financial side of vesting it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not really at company's expense. So the way that the founder shares work is that the company's incorporated at Companies House on day one, and Companies House asks you who the shareholders are, and the shareholders are here, Brian Robbins and Roberta Robbins, and they own it 50-50, and they own their shares, and they're supposed to have paid nominal value for their shares, but it rarely happens. But they own their shares, and they're meant to have paid, and then they own their shares, and then they own them. And so vesting is kind of, it's reverse vesting on that. It's not like at anyone's real expense. When they're kind of, what happens is that when, say, you leave and they've a portion of it that are unvested, there are different ways that they're dealt with. That some are bought back, but that causes problems with the EIS, and some are bought by others, but there's tax issues and it's transfer. But the way you see it most is that they're just converted into deferred worthless shares. So it's automatic, happens very quickly, and they lose their shares, and everyone else shareholding goes up pro rata.
Brilliant, thanks, Aaron. Bola's asking around the terms that exist in term sheets. Do they vary country to country? Is it very different, for example, from the West Coast in the US versus what happens in France, as an example?
Yeah, there are differences. There are differences between East Coast and West Coast in the US, let alone kind of US and UK. We're seeing term sheets that, the likes of like Tiger, who's super active, that's coming in, and these kind of big funds, particularly sort of West Coast, that the term sheet's one page. It doesn't even really deal, like, it's one page, we'll work it out, it's customary, but the valuation's good, and there's reputation, and we're going to trust that that's the right thing. And then you get some funds who the term sheets like 12 pages long, and like, maybe we talk about France, maybe, the more European term sheets we see are the longer ones. They want to cover everything, and they want to cover these in some detail. And the trick is finding the balance between this. It is a key term sheet. Let's cover that. We don't have to draft what the clause is actually going to look like. We just need to say what it's meant to do. So finding a balance between, what you want to cover, how you want to cover it, and not having it too lengthy, because it can scare companies as well. They're like, I don't even know what half this stuff means, and I can't read it. So it doesn't need to be so long.
Yeah, and it's fairly typical. I've seen more and more of this happening, where funds, VCs do put their standard term sheets up on their websites, and let everyone see that this isn't the scariest document in the world. Here it is. We're being pretty transparent. So that's a good trend, I think, the transparency.
You're certainly seeing a lot more kind of openness and transparency with it. Not everyone does it, but there's a kind of like, these term sheets are out in the market. Enough funds are doing enough deals where their term sheets go out. They're not changing it too much. They're not trying to sort of be too clever in deal to deal, but every deal is different. So they'll say this, these are the things, this is what we look at, but it may be that there are some changes to that. But yeah, they want companies to understand that it really is kind of normal stuff, and they're not like looking to take too much. And it's not, hey, we're great, but we're going to give you a term sheet with a 2 times participating. They want the key things for people to understand, that they're invested in helping the founders produce a successful company.
Brilliant. And maybe just one from me, Aaron. I'm just curious from your side of the fence, how are the number of transactions increasing? Are you seeing more, less? Is it the same as it was a couple of years ago, pre-COVID?
No, it's crazy. The number of deals is probably the most I've ever seen. It's number of different factors. COVID is part of that, but starting where COVID first happened and lockdown, and everyone's like, oh my God, this is the end of the world, and this is it, no more market with this. For a while where VC funds in particular were like, whoa, maybe I don't go on super deployment mode because I need to make sure we have cash to kind of back up our existing portfolio, to then getting kind of pretty comfortable with that type of thing, to then going crazy and there's lots of cash to deploy and they're already funded up, and so that needs to be deployed to, so it's not just number of deals, but also the types like deals and crazy valuations and companies doing Series A to Series B in a matter of weeks, and things that we not really seen before. So it's probably the craziest market I've seen.
Yeah, it definitely feels like that in many ways. There's a lot. There's a lot more announcements happening, and then the rounds themselves seem to be fairly substantial. So it's interesting.
Exactly. Yeah.
Great.
And we're also seeing big US funds come in like a lot earlier. Like we're seeing Andreessen Horowitz and Accel and SoftBank and those type of, they're doing seed rounds. We never see that type of thing before. And so the fact that we're getting these type of funds doing these type of rounds in the UK, whereas not that long ago it used to be that you wanted to be B or C to be getting US money. We're seeing them coming in really early because that's just the market and the US appreciation of the companies that we have here and the importance of the market that we have, and they just want to be involved.
Yeah, interestingly, even pretty established European funds or UK funds are now kind of separately setting up first check funds, like Octopus have done that recently, just focused on those seed investments. So we're definitely seeing more of that, which makes it super exciting for those coming into the industry. Excellent. Aaron, as always, thank you so much. That was brilliant. Really enjoy it. I always learn stuff myself, and I'm sure everyone else in the call has. Do reach out to Aaron. Aaron's on LinkedIn, I'm guessing. If you've got any questions, I'm sure he'll be happy to answer. And thanks everyone for attending, and we'll see you on the next session. Aaron, thanks so much again.
Pleasure. All right. Thanks all.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.